was a resurrection of the idea of witchcraft. And this strikes a responsive chord in human nature.
It is what it was, an unfortunate incident. We're left with the consequences of that, and sad to say that a person died.
The lady across the street, she said, "Did you know that Nelson Raymar was killed?" That's the first we knew about it.
These three individuals had no idea that they were going to release the hounds of hell on the community that was totally unprepared for this. In 1967, my uncle asked me to speak at a Rotary Club in Red Lion. I looked for a topic that I thought the Rotarians would be interested in. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. And I found a story about the murder in Raymar's Hollow. It's an old story, but one that can still be told. And that's the hex. My book is called The Trials of Hex, and I wrote the book in 2000. Nelson Raymar lived alone. And so, starting in 1967, I began my journey with Hex and the Raymar murder.
I write books on the history and folklore of Pennsylvania. One of the things years ago that got me interested in witchcraft was the York Hex murder. It was kind of surprising that something like that happened so recently. Surprised to find that it was actually a fairly common belief. The belief in powwows and hexes was widespread throughout the state, and it really sparked my interest in the whole topic.
I first learned about the story about Nelson Raymar's murder several years ago. My birthday, I got a book called Weird USA. I got the impression that there was a lot more to the story than what they had put in this Weird USA book. I kind of felt like that Nelson Raymar wasn't all as bad as they were making him out to be, and that somehow it was a lie. I eventually was able to meet some of the family members, people who were related to the Raymars, and started asking them about the Raymar family history and came to visit, became a close friend. And from then on, I've just been doing a lot of research regarding Nelson Raymar and his murder.
There was a high level of prosperity ongoing in 1928. The Great Depression had not yet occurred, and people were doing very well. Farmers were prospering. It was a time when the stock market was booming, and the economy was humming along at a high level of productivity.
Pennsylvania was going through a lot of changes in the 1920s. America was in general, and Pennsylvania was experiencing those. There were still a lot of rural areas in Pennsylvania, and a lot of the German traditions, especially in Pennsylvania Dutch country, had survived. Although Pennsylvania was modernizing rapidly, there was certainly a growing resistance to traditional ideas and superstitions and belief in things like powwows and hexes.
My whole background with getting started with genealogy goes back to my dad's side of the family. My dad died when I was 13 months old, so I had his parents. Not a lot of information. In the 70s, my grandmother gave me a notebook that she had started. I got this notebook out, and I started going and doing the research.
This is the modified rec room, catch-all, exercise room, studio, and workspace. Since I've got this area cleaned up here, and I've got the electric, I figured I'm going to use this to do my genealogy. I got a place I can put stuff on the walls. I can hang pictures on my backdrop here. I find genealogy is like working on a crossword puzzle or a jigsaw puzzle. You work on the information you know most at hand, that you are more familiar with. And then you go from there and you work backwards.
Anyone in the area that wants to know about Raymeyers just has to come look at me. I've either got the information or I will find it for them.
The Raymeyers lived in a little town called Uchte, Germany.
In 1841, Henry and Wilhelmina came to America. He then brought his two brothers over.
Christoph Raymeyer and Karl Raymeyer came the next year in 1844.
The three brothers pooled their money together and bought 96 acres, which is Raymeyer's Hollow. Christoph and his family stayed in the same house and same property the three brothers started.
You see that little small white farmhouse there, kind of fallen down? Inside of that is the original log cabin that Christoph built when he settled into this land over here. He had a lot of kids, so eventually he built this house that we're coming up to right now. It's been changed. You see two windows up on the second floor. There used to be a third one in the middle. This front section used to be a porch. Now they've closed it in. They've also put an addition on the back.
The Raymeyers was a large family. There were many people, many Raymeyers in that area, and that's why the area was called Raymeyer's Hollow.
Nelson Raymeyer was born to Henry Raymeyer and Rachel McCann. Nelson was born October of 1868.
He lived alone in an isolated area of the hollow. He was a farmer. He raised potatoes on his farm.
Some people thought he was a little strange for a few reasons. He's been described as a hermit or a recluse, which isn't quite right. He was, in fact, an amiable fellow, but he kind of liked to stay on his farm, sort of keep to himself.
He was basically living by himself back in the hollow, kind of part outcast, part healer, and kind of a mixture of things.
It was a small house, and it wasn't furnished well. I mean, very sparsely. He had a stove, a sink to do his dishes, then the table and chairs, and then in the party had a couch to rest. It was a tiny house.
He married his wife, Alice. There was quite a lot of an age difference between them. There was about 10 years. So when they married, I think Alice was about 18. Nelson would have been about 28.
He had two daughters, Beatrice and Edna. Beatrice was 10, Edna was 14.
Beatrice was my age. Edna was older. Edna couldn't do much. She didn't have much brain. Beatrice was nice to play with. And the mother, she had a squeaking voice, and she talked. Well, I don't know. I didn't have much to do with her, but I'll never forget her.
His guns, papers, revolvers and stuff, and his shotgun that he would go out and go hunting with it. Like, hunt all the time. Rabbit, pheasant, paper shells, original shells. Still fires yet. Yeah.
You shot that gun?
Yeah, I shot this many a times and walked with that. My first gun when I was like, maybe 10 years old or something like that.
You were raised by your grandparents, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Your grandmother was Nelson's youngest daughter.
That's right, Beatrice, yeah.
After Beatrice had passed away, her husband, Kenneth Ebaugh, he had to get the house in his name. So after his death, he had willed it to me. And that was in '93, and I've had the house ever since. Nelson was viewed in the community as trying to do whatever he could do to help people, whether it was your crop or whether it was somebody sick. They knew that once he was there, it would be a turning point.
As a child, I could remember him. I thought he was a pretty nice-looking man. Nelson was pretty big. I imagine he was going on 6 feet, maybe. I don't know. But he seemed big for us children.
Yeah, look at that.
See the size of him.
Yeah, gives you an idea of how tall he was.
He had some strange leanings. He was reputed to be a socialist. There was socialist literature in his house.
Socialism, I'm sure that was kind of strange for his time and place.
That invoked the kind of ire of some of his neighbors who did not like his political beliefs.
You said your dad didn't hang out with Nelson, or they weren't close?
No, the only reason he'd stop if he got out that way, he knew a lot of farmers, you know, they knew each other. And he would out in that area, he'd stop and talk to him just a short while.
At a real young age, was taught how to, what they call, powwow.
Powwow is Pennsylvania German folk healing. In itself, it is a very simple thing. It's what one of my teachers called active prayer. Some people will call it magic, folk magic, and to a certain extent, it does fall into that realm, but there are many practitioners who shun the word entirely.
Nelson was an active powwow practitioner. He had a reputation in the community as a powwow practitioner.
A lot of people went to powwow doctors. Many preferred powwow doctors to regular medical doctors.
It encompasses so many areas of life, such as protection, detection of curses, not just physical healing, but spiritual healing as well.
I spoke to Charlie Miller, who lived a couple miles away. He said he knew Nelson very well, and he said he often talked to him about his powwowing, about the things that he was doing. And he urged him to, as he put it, stop the nonsense, because he told Nelson that it was bound to get him into a lot of trouble. His wife and 2 daughters, they left because she simply couldn't tolerate people coming to the house at all hours of the day and night, and Nelson powwowing.
Always had people lined up to get in the house, to take care of people, whether it was, didn't matter if it was a cut on your hand or a wart, or whether you were very sick or ill and something you couldn't eat, and if you had a fever or anything like that, or earache, and anything from a young person till people that was up in age in their 80s, 90s maybe, he would, you know, it didn't matter. Always helping people.
So do you think that's the reason your great-grandparents lived apart the last 4 years of Nelson's life?
Alice never, like I say, liked his powwowing with the girls. And so she was always over at her place. That was where she was born and raised. So she was over the hill at her farm over there.
All right, so what I'm doing now is creating a charm for someone to carry with them in their wallet for protection while they travel. And it also has the 5-pointed star, which is a symbol of protection. Well, I started studying powwow in the mid-1990s, and I started actively practicing powwow around 2006, 2007. The appeal to powwow for me is that it's a Christian practice, a religious practice, and to me it works. I feel like it is an effective form of folk magic. The main goal for my website was to collect all of the research that I'm putting together and have it made available, easily available to anybody who was interested in it. Anytime an individual comes to me for powwowing or just to even discuss the powwowing procedure, I always put the disclaimer that this is just one step in the process. They should always follow up with a medical physician. I do let them know that I'm not a licensed physician. I can't give medical advice. All I can do is essentially pray for them.
It was very much a part of the culture of the community. There were powwow practitioners on practically every street corner in York.
Powwowers today, although we're Christian, we do still have those other Christians who feel that what we're doing is wrong, satanic, and completely unwilling to discuss it or really learn what it's truly about.
When you believe that you're a conduit for God's healing energy, you are not the power itself. What you're doing is you are opening yourself up to God's power, and you're praying. You're praying for somebody, you're praying with them.
Powwow, however, attracted the attention of people in the medical establishment, especially after the Progressive era. You see from the 1890s onward, a more concerted attack against the practice of powwow as the powwowers being viewed as not real doctors. And as the medical profession becomes more and more professionalized, you see a concentrated attack on all those sort of pseudo-doctors as they would view them.
So you have the power of the spoken word. Then there is also physical touch, the hands. When we talk about the laying on of hands, one does not come in contact with the actual body of the client, but goes over the energetic body.
For a headache, the spoken component for the headache charm that I use, one of the popular ones, would be "Tame thou flesh and bone like Christ in paradise, and who will assist thee? This I tell thee, person's name, for your repentance sake." And the gesture that I would use for that is to pull the headache from the head and toss it to the side. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
What I'm writing here is basically an edible charm. My medium is chocolate syrup, and in the past, this would have been an ink, say perhaps like a pokeberry ink. And sometimes these types of charms are used for people who need to ingest the energy of these charms instead of maybe just, say, hanging them around their neck or in a pouch. And normally what I would do is pray while doing this. After one prays over this and gives it a little bit of energy, the idea is to rinse these letters off ever so gently, and that all of that prayer energy and what's represented by the charm itself will be ingested by the person that it's meant for. The person suffering with the fever or whatever would sip this, drink it all in one sitting. The real power is in the prayer itself and in the divine that wills it to be that someone should get better, God willing. If not, then it won't work.
The Long Lost Friend was the most common and most popularly used book by powwow doctors. It came out in 1820. It was published by a German immigrant named John George Homan.
I acquired this copy of The Long Lost Friend. It's an 1855 copy from an employee that used to work for me. He was an elder gentleman. He told me that he had a copy of it, and I offered to purchase it from him. I think it works to a degree. There's a lot of conjuring and things like that that I don't necessarily believe in, but I think some of the home remedies that the book has in it are valid. I wouldn't get rid of the book mostly because I'm superstitious about getting rid of it.
There was nothing involving the dark arts or putting hexes on people in The Long Lost Friend. It was very common. It wasn't some secret esoteric manuscript that only a few people had. It was readily available and very widely used among the Pennsylvania Dutch farmers.
Is a collection of mysterious and invaluable arts and remedies for man as well as animals, with many proofs. And the book tells us that whoever has this book will be safe from all harm.
We're gonna go down Ebaugh Road. Now this house coming down here off to the right, that's the house Alice Raymeyer grew up in. She inherited that house, so that when she and Nelson couldn't quite make a go of it as a domestic partnership, she just moved into here so she'd have her own space and they'd be out of each other's hair. Nelson would take his dirty laundry and drop it off at the top of the hill, and Mrs. Raymeyer, Alice, would continue to do his laundry for him.
She took the finished clothing, she washed it and fixed it up, and met him at the top of the hill. I guess they had the date fixed, and he brought his dirty clothes and they exchanged. They said they did that for quite some time. I don't know, I didn't see it.
I've been doing artwork my entire life. Ever since I was small, I've been drawing, doing things, and once I got to school, I got to play around with different mediums such as painting, printmaking, and things like that. And I enjoy doing it all. This one up here was based off of an image that I saw of Nelson Raymeyer. I just love how this picture kind of captures the time period. Just the fact that John Blymeyer was related to me, that really intrigued me to want to explore it more. I can't really say that I'm ashamed to be related to John Blymeyer. I know a lot of the older people in the family, they would have a different opinion because they knew him. It really didn't hit me until I matured and it was later in life that he actually killed someone. We're on our way to Ebaugh Blymeyer. He's my great-great-uncle. He's the nephew of John Blymeyer, so his dad had a lot of communication with John Blymeyer growing up, so he'll have a lot of good stories for you.
Yep. Witchcraft persists in rural districts, and it has Hopewell Township. That's where it happened. My mother told me the story, and she got the newspaper and then showed the newspaper to me. I was 6 years old. I was in the first grade. Well, it was a shock to me. I mean, I didn't think anything like that would ever happen in the family. And it was something, like I said, had to do with witchcraft. There's John. John would have been 18 and 5. He'd have been 23.
John Blymeyer was born to Emmanuel Blymeyer and Margaret Blymeyer. He was born with a cloud over his head.
I suppose you would call him sort of a drifter. He had had a difficult time of it.
His IQ was once tested as very low normal. He was sort of on the borderline between being normal and what they might have called an idiot or an imbecile back in those days.
In 1928, he was trying to reestablish himself, trying to get a job, and that's when he became obsessed with the notion that, as he put it, the witches were following him, and he was under a curse.
I've always believed that he truly believed he was hexed, and he really had a strong belief in the whole system of powwow and hex. He didn't do very well in school. He wasn't necessarily highly educated. He had been trained as a powwower, and he was apparently successful at that. It was one thing he excelled at.
He came from a long line of powwowers. His father was a powwower, as was his grandfather before him.
At one point, when he was working at the scar factory, he was leaving work one day with his coworkers, and a rabid dog came up to the front of the factory. He walked up to it, performed some kind of incantation or blessing on the dog. The dog apparently stopped foaming at the mouth. He patted it on its head, and it went on its way.
I think John Blymeyer had a very hard life. And it was just a series of one mishap after another, one unfortunate event after another with him. And I believe he was looking for somebody else to blame other than himself.
After he got married, he married a woman named Lily. Both of their children died early on.
He was diagnosed as being a neurotic, and he was also diagnosed by one doctor as having witch delusions.
It was the 1920s. People didn't talk about mental illnesses unless you were being institutionalized. And I believe he actually spent some time in an institution.
He had been in and out of the state hospital at Harrisburg, and he had only been there a short time. And he took off.
He just casually walked off the grounds of the hospital and walked all the way back to York.
Is there any other mental illness in your family?
I have a son that's, yeah. I mean, he can do everything, but he's on the mental side. When he was about 18 years old, I had him at the psychiatric ward at York Hospital, and they corrected him with medication. He'd get upset quick if something happened. But now, like I say, you never figured it was that way.
I think he was a paranoid man, and I think the person that he ultimately went to played into his paranoia and fear.
In Marietta, which is a little river town in Lancaster County, it's just across the Susquehanna River, he went to a very noted witch there named Emma Knopp. She's better known today as Nellie Knoll, the Witch of Marietta, she was called. She was in her 70s, she was old and bent, scraggly white hair, a hooked nose.
He thought that he could get her to reveal the identity of the person hexing him.
She told him to put a dollar bill in the palm of his hand, and he did that. And when the dollar bill was taken away, the picture of Raymeyer appeared in the palm of his hand. So Blymeyer knew him, knew about him, and undoubtedly knew his reputation in the community as a powwow practitioner.
Emma Knopp said, if you want to remove the curse, what you need to do is you need to cut off a lock of Raymeyer's hair, bury it 8 feet underground, and get his book of spells, and burn the book of spells.
The German word for powwow is braucherei. The German word for witchcraft is hexerei, and it's the root of the word where we get the word hex now. I would say the difference between a powwow and a witch lies in the intent of the person doing the magic. A powwow, the intent should be good, to heal, to protect. Whereas a witch, generally hexerei, is self-serving. It's magic to get revenge or cause discord. I do definitely believe there is a devil, and I do believe that there are individuals out there who call upon the devil or tap into the devil's energy in some way to cause discord, cursing, and hexing.
If one has the power to help somebody, it only stands to reason that it's also equally true that a person, if they desire to do so, can harm someone. I myself have been on the receiving end of curses. They range from being just a pain in the neck to being life-threatening.
So there was an individual local who was working witchcraft against me, and what I did was I put that individual's name on a slip of paper and surrounded it with drawings of crucifixes, and I wrapped it in red string, and I have it locked inside of this crucifix as a binding so that person can no longer take magical action against me. It's not designed to harm anyone, it's designed so they cannot actively work black magic against me.
To be witchcraft is the same as giving yourself over to the devil. Completely.
Blymeyer had convinced his young friend John Curry, who his life was he was having terrible luck in his life, that he too was under a curse from Nelson Rehmeyer.
John Curry was only 14 years old.
He had a stable family. He had a very good relationship with his father. His father often took him places, took him fishing, and was just a loving, devoted father.
And at the age of 5, his father died. His mother moved about and lived in various places. They eventually ended up in York.
She came up toward York, Pennsylvania, and married her second husband. His name was McLean. Now, McLean was a no-good drunk. He didn't work much. He was a foul-tempered man. He would beat John's mother, and he also beat John Curry quite a bit.
And so it was this kind of conduct that drove Curry into the streets.
He worked at a cigar factory, the same cigar factory where John Blymeyer worked. There was a certain pathos in this friendship they developed. It was almost as if, that's all they had was each other.
My dad's impression when he spoke of John Curry was just that he was a quiet, well-mannered, unassuming kid. He wasn't a leader, he was a follower. And he was more laid back and just would have been easily led.
Curry said that Blymeyer saved his life. He powwowed for him for whatever affliction Curry was undergoing. He credited Blymeyer with having taken care of it and having solved his health problem. So Curry felt very beholden to Blymeyer.
He was just a kid. He was just led into doing something that he really didn't know what was going on.
Hess was a farm boy from Leaders Heights. He was 18 years old. His meeting Blymeyer came about because Blymeyer and Curry ran across his father, Milton. The Hess family was having a lot of trouble that summer. They lost some livestock. It was pretty dry. Some of the crops were failing.
Everybody at home was getting various illnesses, and it was just this sudden wave of bad luck.
My grandmother, Ida Jane Strickler Hess, would have been Wilbert Hess's aunt. Milton's family had a much more difficult time making ends meet than my grandmother's family, who lived pretty much next door. This is the road. The house on the left, which if you follow the dirt road, you'll go up there. This was a road that went into the back of their property. If you go a little bit further to the right, under the trees there, that's where Milton Hess and their family lived.
They had a property boundary dispute. Ida Hess wanted right-of-way to her farm and apparently needed that right-of-way along the boundary line with Milton's farm. Well, Milton did not want to allow her this land so that she would have a right-of-way, and it became very ugly. It became a real family squabble.
There was a suspicion there about, well, how come your family is doing okay and my family isn't? So being this powwowing thing that was going on at the time, I think that that's where the suspicion grew up, that somehow that somebody must have put a hex on their family, and because there was this argument going on between the two families, it must have been my grandmother, which is, for those who knew my grandmother, would have been pretty much ridiculous.
Wilbert's mother, Alice, she was very superstitious. And when Blymeyer came into this, he only reinforced what she thought was going on.
They had troubles, and John had him believing Nelson Rehmeyer is the one that put the spell on you, and you got to get a lock of his hair to break that spell.
All of this had been building. This business of their being under a curse had been building and building and building, and finally it was decided that they had to act. The first visit occurred on the night of the 26th of November. Clayton Hess, son of Alice and Milton, drove Blymeyer and Curry.
He drove them down to Hangtown, and from Hangtown they walked into the Hollow.
And they stopped at the home of Mrs. Raymeyer. And they knocked on the door. Mrs. Raymeyer came to the door, and they asked where they could find Nelson. And she said, well, as far as she knew, he was over at his place, another mile or so deeper in the hollow. So off they went to Raymeyer's house. They get to Raymeyer's house, they knock on the door.
Great-grandfather opened the door up and come on in. And they were friends. Come on into the kitchen and we'll sit down and have a drink.
John Blymeyer and Nelson Raymeyer talked for quite a long time about farming and powwowing and other things going on in the community. By the time they finished, it was very late, and Nelson, as he was wont to do, said, listen, why don't you guys stay the night?
So the next morning after breakfast, Blymeyer and Curry go back to Leaders Heights.
Now, what they had made out during that visit was that Nelson was a really big man. They didn't feel like, between the two of them, they didn't have enough muscle to subdue Nelson Raymeyer.
And that's when Blymeyer told Mrs. Hess that Raymeyer is big and strong, and he would need help to bring the man down.
He was able to talk Milt Hess and Alice into allowing their son, Wilbert, to accompany the Curry boy and Blymeyer to this house.
She said that he could miss a day's work and go down to the hollow for something as important as breaking the curse.
August 1974, I started working here. This was Snyder Super Thrift. But I started here for $2.10 an hour, my second job. My job was a cart person, the porch boy. And we took care of customers would come out the doors with their groceries. I'd follow them out to their cars, help them load their groceries, and always brought the carts back up here and lined them up. Customers came in, I'd pull a cart out if they wanted them so they could have it. While I was working here, some of the guys that were with me out here at times, they knew a gentleman. They kept calling him Mr. Hess. How you doing today, Mr. Hess? See you later, Mr. Hess. That's all I knew him by.
And one day he just stopped me and he asked if I was still in school. And I said, yes, I was still in school. I was graduating. And he says, are you going on for further schooling? I said, yes. I was getting ready to go to the Ohio Institute of Technology for electronics. He goes, good. He said, do something with your life. Don't make any mistakes and foul up your life like I did mine. That kind of left an open door for me to ask him, what do you mean, what'd you do? He goes, me and two other guys went down into Raymeyer's Hollow, and we killed Nelson Raymeyer. I didn't have the heart to tell him I was related to Nelson, so I just kind of said, oh, what happened?
The three of them went down, again, taken down by Clayton to Raymeyer's house.
He just takes a deep breath and looks at me and he goes, we went down there, it was late at night, we knocked on the door.
Kept rapping on the door till they got Nelson out of bed, which is like 11:30 at night. And when somebody would rap on the door, stand outside, he would open up the window and throw open the shutters and see who was out here.
Raymeyer, apparently already in bed, he stuck his head out the bedroom window with a lantern and says, who's there? And Blymeyer says, it's me, again.
So they told him that they thought they had left something from the previous evening when they had slept over.
He admitted the three boys. They went in and they started looking around the house.
He said, we get in and not long after we were in, John looks at him and says, we want your book. And Nelson's like, what book? He goes, you know your book. He goes, I don't know what you're talking about. He goes, yeah, you know which book I'm talking about. I need that in the lock of your hair.
It's not clear. There are different versions of just what happened, but at one point, Raymeyer was in the kitchen.
And as he turns to put wood in the stove,
Blymeyer said, get him.
They grab him.
He said, John grabbed him. We all kind of jumped on him.
They There was a violent struggle that increased in intensity.
Blymeyer picked up a kitchen chair and broke it over Raymeyer's back.
Got him on the floor, and he had wood piled up here in the corner.
Curry picked up a chunk of wood and hit him on the head.
Nelson goes limp. He's just laying there on the floor.
It was such a powerful blow that it broke through his skull, and the fragments of his skull lacerated Raymeyer's brain, and that caused a massive hemorrhage in his brain.
Tied his feet and tied his hands, had him tied up.
Blymeyer and Curry had purchased about 25 feet of rope, which they cut up into 5-foot lengths. They were going to use these lengths of rope to tie up his hands and his feet so that he couldn't resist when they cut his hair. They tied a piece of the rope around his neck in an effort to strangle him.
They finally determined that he was dead.
John says, I think he's dead. If he's dead, the hex is done. We're over. We're good. The witch is gone.
There's some question now, though, as to whether he was actually dead.
I think he might well have been unconscious at that point, but they thought he was dead.
This third step here was where Nelson Raymeyer used to keep his money and gold in there in tin cans. So they ripped all these steps up.
Blymeyer had the idea that what they should do was light up the body and set Raymeyer's dead body and the whole house on fire. When they set the house on fire, that would burn up all the evidence.
Threw oil on top of him all around the area. Last thing he had to do was throw a match down on the floor there and light him on fire. And that's what they did.
When they walked outside the house and looked back, they thought they saw Raymeyer moving about in the flame. I think it's altogether possible that Raymeyer was moving about in the flames, desperately trying to get out.
Well, in fact, the house did not burn. Something extinguished the fire.
Could be possible it did burn because of Raymeyer, or the witchcraft, that it did burn.
A lot of people thought it was God that, didn't burn it down.
On Thanksgiving Day, November 29th, David Vanover, a nearby neighbor, was walking out that afternoon after Thanksgiving dinner and noticed that the animals in Raymeyer's barn were making a lot of noise.
They wanted something to drink and something to eat. And he fed them first. He told me, he didn't know where he was at.
He was tipped off by a mailman that Nelson hadn't picked up his mail in a couple of days. And maybe you should go down there and look. So David Vanover went and got another neighbor, Oscar Glatfelter. Vanover and Glatfelter went to the house, tapped on the door. There was no answer. They went inside.
And seen him laying here all burned up, smoke all over the kitchen, everything black. He got back on his horse and went over the hill to Alice and said, something bad has happened to your husband. You better get over to the house.
The wood was burnt the whole way through, and the only thing was sticking out was the charcoal boards where it went out. There was a little bit of that sticking on the boards where it was black.
The night that they had murdered him and laid him on top of this beam up here, the floor joist, where he would have fell down through, but he fell down through, but got caught on the potato bin, and his body hung over top of that floor joist. As his body went over top of the floor joist, and the fluids from his body ran down on this, it out and smothered the fire, plus the potato bin he had there kind of held him in place, and it kind of outed it. If he'd have fell on down through and he wouldn't have had the potato bin there, The fire might have took off and burned the house down.
That was a sad time then. Of course, my mother said, Nelson killed. That sounds all. I mean, everybody was shocked and nobody knew anything yet. Poor Nelson.
Oh my, they had police out there. My dad went out there that day. Him and another Raymar. They couldn't get close. There's so many police around that they made them turn around.
My father was teaching in New Freedom, had this bus, and on the way home, he said, we're going into Wagner's. And he parked the car and said, come along.
Wagner's funeral home was in Shrewsbury. That's the mortician who collected the body and prepared it for burial.
I still don't know why he took me along in, and there was Nelson laying on the place there, and his knee was still bent up, but he was all covered up now. And that just took me.
The funeral was on the 5th of December, 1928. A huge crowd of people came to the funeral.
Sadler's Church had 2 big wood stoves, I guess, one on either side, and they were going full force. They opened all the windows because the whole outside was full of people that couldn't get into the church. That was a big funeral.
After the murder, it was Alice Raymar's then widow who gave the authorities the tip.
When he turned up dead, she immediately notified the police that those 3 men visited her house looking for him.
Well, the police rounded up Blymeyer and Curry and asked them, did you have anything to do with the Raymeyer murder? They said, well, yeah, that was us. And explained to him that Raymeyer was a witch who had hexed him, so they had to kill him. They were not apologetic about it, especially in the case of Blymeyer. He just said, yeah, the man hexed me. What was I supposed to do?
And they all 3 confessed and were put in jail. And they were there until after the trials. From the end of November until the end of the trials, which would have been the first full week of January 1929. The trials took place in the city of York, a remarkable series of trials. This is the portrait of Justice Cohen. In 1929, he was a young lawyer. He was a good friend of Judge Sherwood's because he had assisted Judge Sherwood in the election campaign that resulted in him being elected to the bench in the fall of 1927. And Sherwood appointed him pro bono counsel for Blymeyer. Judge Sherwood was very firm at the outset of the trial and said that there would be no talk, no evidence presented relative to hex or witchcraft.
They were trying to prosecute the case as a robbery gone wrong, but unfortunately, in the testimony of Clayton Hess, Wilbert Hess's brother, the word witch came out, and it came out into the record.
That opened the door so that Cohen could then get into evidence this whole business of witchcraft and powwow. Herman objected. The judge said, Mr. Herman, You've opened the door. Now we have to allow it in. So that changed the whole architecture of the trial. And now Cohen, whose defense was insanity, could talk about the fact that Blymeyer was insane because of his belief in witchcraft and powwow. And he argued to the jury that all of John's life was bound in misery and in shadow, with the body of a man, but the ghost-haunted mind of a child. He trudged down that lonely road to Ender. He had no idea that what he did was wrong. He had no idea. So acquit him on the grounds of insanity and send him to an institution where he can get relief for his awful imaginings.
Jury convicts Blymeyer of first-degree murder, recommends life sentence.
When I talked to Cohen many years ago, Cohen told me Blymeyer was seated beside him throughout the trial. He said he looked up at the ceiling, looked up at the windows, cracked his knuckles. He turned to me and said, "Mr. Cohen, the witch is dead. I can eat and sleep in peace now, but I think they went a bit strong. That's it. I think they went a bit strong." In the Curry trial, Walter Van Beeman was counsel. He was appointed pro bono, just as Cohen was appointed pro bono. And when I talked to Van Beeman about his recollection of the trial, he said that he gave very little credibility to this whole notion of witchcraft and powwow. And his argument to the jury and his approach to the case was that Curry was the victim of social neglect and parental abuse. When he addressed the jury, at one point he wheeled around and pointed to Curry's mother, and he said, "There is the person responsible for this boy being where he is today." And with that, the mother, who already had stuffed her mouth with her apron to suppress her sobs, collapsed on the courtroom floor. The Curry trial set a record for its brevity, and it was over in less than a day. The jury was back with a first-degree murder and life in prison verdict, just as in the Blymeyer trial. This is the courtroom where the trial actually occurred. It's been converted from a courtroom to the York County Commissioner's meeting room. The chairs are located pretty much as they were in 1929. You can see the outline of the room, the frame of the room, all of that remains unchanged. It was as it was in 1929. This is the portrait of Harvey Gross that depicted Gross at the time that he left the bench in 1957. He was retained by Milton Hess to represent Wilbert. He was not pro bono. He didn't see how he could possibly overcome the momentum that had been building as a result of the verdicts in the first two cases. He cross-examined Mrs. Hess, and he said, "Now, Mrs. Hess, when did you first learn that Raymeyer was dead?" Why, she said, "The next morning. My son Wilbert came over from Clayton's house and said, 'Mother, I didn't want to go down there last night, and I didn't want to do what they got me to do. But the man is dead. I hope you will get better. I hope you will get better.'" And Gross said, "I had it. He was the sacrificial lamb. He went down to the hollow to break the curse, to save his family." That became his theme. At one point, he pointed to Mrs. Hess and said, "That poor woman no more wanted to send her boy down to the hollow that night than did old Abraham in the book of Genesis want to lead his son up to that altar on a high mountain. Only in this case," he said, "God did not provide a substitute for the sacrifice." And that was a very powerful moment in his closing argument, because it analogized an event that everybody on that jury could fully understand and appreciate. With that, the case ended. Gross said we were there. It's a Saturday night now. And he said, finally, the tip staff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. We find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree, 10 years. And he said a sense of overwhelming joy swept through the courtroom. He and that jury had transformed the tawdry violence of superstition and witchcraft and murder into what I call a York County epic. The fact that that jury was able to see in what Hess had done there, the element of sacrifice as the highest calling of humanity.
It was more quiet unless somebody asked questions about it. I never had full contact with him in my life. He served 23 and a half years in Eastern Penitentiary. He got out in April of 1953. I was in Korea at the time, and he came to visit my father. I said, I understand, Uncle John was here to visit. Yeah. Went out for a walk. They were going about 45 minutes and came back. And after he left, my father said, that man would do the same thing today yet. There's no change. Gertrude Rudy was 16 years old. They found her in the railroad tracks, shot with a shotgun at close range. Here about 10 years ago, it was in a paper again, it says, murder never solved, 73 years. Well, my uncle, I'm sure, is the one that done away with her. They never caught up with him. They used to see her go to his place. He wasn't with his wife at the time. He was 31 years old. And apparently, what happened, he got her pregnant and wanted to do away with her. Because my father said the shotgun he had disappeared after that happened. It was just to be so. He put her in the railroad tracks, figured the train would hit her and tear her, and never knew what happened. But here, at that time, they had lanterns. A guy that switched the track for the train just happened to look up and saw this hump in the track. And he went up in here. She was laying here, found her. And Judge Sherwood put it up to him at the trial about this Gertrude Rudy, and he cried like a baby, said he didn't do it. Sherwood said, well, if I know actually you done it, he said, you're going to the chair. There ain't no question about it. I would say 90% someone done it. I think he had got pneumonia or something there, and it wasn't long after that he passed away, the 10th of May, 72, and he's buried in the Red Lion Cemetery. Nobody in my family attended his funeral. We had calls from our side for pallbearers. Nobody wanted to be a pallbearer, so they went out in the street and got them off the street to be the pallbearers.
Curry got paroled after 10 years. He joined the armed forces, was on Eisenhower's staff, and helped to draft plans for the invasion of Normandy.
There you go. Okay, there you go. John was a kind of an exceptional person. He was a friend of mine and of my wife's. I was about 17 years old. I worked for him from the time I got out of high school until right before I went in the service in '55. And he was just a super guy to be with. I helped him on the farm with his turkey business. I helped him haul turkeys. I helped him to feed the turkeys, and he had Black Angus steers. We fed the steers, and just miscellaneous work around the place.
When he came to our house, and I was sitting across the table from him, now and then when we were talking, the thought would go through my mind, now this man could have, killed someone when he was young, but it couldn't be this same guy. His appearance and his manner, it just seemed that you couldn't believe that he had been involved in any kind of a murder.
I never realized when I worked for him he was involved in what he was. He never mentioned it to me at any time, and I never really knew until I was there for a couple of years. One time I went to pick up a crate of turkeys, and there were 5 tums in, and they weighed about 30 pounds apiece, and it was heavy. And he said, Dick, he said, don't hurt yourself. He said, I was hurt when I was a boy. And he said, I don't want anybody to hurt themselves at your age.
I was 16 years old. Llewellyn Curry, his wife, became director of physical education at the YWCA. I knew that her husband had been in jail for the hex crime, and he'd learned to paint when he was in jail. And she asked if there would be volunteers to sit for him to paint the portrait, and I volunteered. He was a well-kept man, very nice, very soft-spoken, and I couldn't imagine that he was in prison for his crime. It just means something very special to me, and I plan to pass it down to my grandchildren.
He was 49 years old when he passed away, and I think that he had a heart attack. He was shoveling off a load of corn and had a heart attack. The thing that I noticed most was the size of his hands when he was in the coffin. You could see the amount of work he had done. He was very farm-minded and worked hard in his life. Everybody thinks that John is the killer. They don't know the real John, Yeah, it's...
Ironically, Hess served his full term. He was there 10 years.
When Wilbert got out of jail, a little bit like Curry, they both had the opportunity to learn some things along the way.
I liked Wilbert Hess. He was a nice guy to work with. Wilbert Hess was married to my cousin. And I didn't really know this until he came to work at McKay Company when I was still there. I worked there from '56 to 1974 when I moved away. And he was working there around the time that I moved away from York.
His children, Don and Oeda Hess, went to school where I went to school. He lived in that location. There was an older home that was located right there. I think it was an old frame house where we used to go to stand out of the cold when I'm waiting for our bus in the morning.
I never saw him do a hateful thing or say a hateful thing, but I'm sure that he thought he was doing something right. I don't think he thought he was doing something terrible.
Well, I think there was a stain on the family. He certainly didn't bring it up in any way to bring attention to himself. I guess attempted to lead as quiet a life as he possibly could. Those people that knew him well, of course, knew about this, but people along the way maybe had no clue that he was Wilbert Hess who was involved in this murder at one point.
How has it affected your life in any way? Have people looked on you with suspicion, thinking you're descendant of a famous witch and hexer?
No, sure. The house, they think this is like an evil house and supposed to have, bad things happen back here, and, it's just...
People point at you and say, that's the great-grandson of the witch. Anybody give you any trouble?
The younger people and whoever approaches me of that and says, hex and witch, evil. Yeah, that's not, you try to explain that to people. He was not like that. There's got to be a turning point somewhere here. It has to start going, that they find out the real truth, as to say this evil, bad person made out to be from the night they murdered him. So this, you know, it's got to happen in time here somewhere.
The Nelson Rehmeyer murder represents kind of the clash between old traditions and the modern world on one level. But it also showed that beliefs in powwow and folk beliefs don't go away. It's the 1920s, almost 1930s in America. You don't expect to find witches, but the fact is, belief in witchcraft has always been there.
There's an afterworld price tag for doing evil works. Why Nelson Rehmeyer would want to jeopardize his standing in the hereafter or his physical well-being in this world through the practice of witchcraft for somebody like Bleimeyer, I don't understand what the motive would have been.
Did he scare you?
No, he never scared us. Nelson was a kind man.
If you look at the aftermath of the trial, it's kind of an example of what sociologists call moral panic, where you have this extreme reaction to one event. It's a good example early on in the 20th century how the media can kind of drive the way that the public looks at certain things.
The murder and the subsequent trial brought a lot of national focus to the community, and it sort of opened up the lid on Pennsylvania Dutch culture in York County.
People from the outside portrayed the Pennsylvania Dutch as these strange rural people in Pennsylvania who had these beliefs in witchcraft in the 20th century. Most of the world didn't know such a thing existed in Pennsylvania, but afterwards it was an emergency, all because of the one murder.
"15 years ago, we stopped renting the house. Wanted to put it back to the original state, take it back into the 1920s. Wanted to really tell the true story of this gruesome murder that had taken place that night. Would like to open the house up and let people tour the house, show the people how he farmed and stuff, and the inventions that he had made to make farming and life easier, so they could see just how this man really was back in the 1920s.
It's a fascinating story. It's a timeless story. And people will be reading and talking about it 100 years from now.
I swear to God, I met the devil. She was standing alone in the pouring rain, cold and gray, just like metal. On her wrist and ankle, there a chain, on a back row without a name. Back row without a name. She wore a tattoo of an angel fingernails, they were full of dirt. She had no teeth and her tongue was tangled. When she spoke, her words came out reversed on a back road without a name. A back road without